So a while back I made a video of how I painted my AirPods black, and I figured since I'm doing the same with my new AirPod Pros now, I'll make a video about that too. The main difference, of course, is the silicone tips that the Pros have. And with the new ones, there's also the touch sensitive area, which I first wanted to be sure that actually won't be an issue. In order to test that, what I did, I connected my AirPods to one of my devices, in this case an iPad, and I covered the sensitive area with some tape. It's fairly thick tape, and I made 2 layers just to be sure that it's really not an issue if there's a physical barrier in between the sensor and the finger. So as you can see, when I cover the sensors so that the AirPod thinks it's in my ear and I'm swiping up and down on the stem, the volume on the iPad adjusts without any issue, and so I knew I could spray even a thick layer of paint without that hindering any of the functionality of that part. So here are the things that you will need to follow these instructions, starting with some spray paint. I'm using a generic matte black acrylic paint. You'll need some hot glue, although most of the things you probably could do with only the tape. I found hot glue a bit easier to manage. You'll need some tape, and you'll need a cutting board and a cutting knife. Now, this is probably a good point to remind you that if you do this, it's on your own risk, and just be aware that if there will be a technical fault, even unrelated to this modification, chances are Apple would not cover any things that are under warranty just based on the fact that you meddled with the product. So basically, just because everything worked fine for me, it's still your own risk that you're taking if you do this. So basically what I'm doing is I'll use the hot glue to cover any of the black parts of the AirPods. So that means all the microphone covers and the covers for the sensors which tell the AirPod that they're in your ear. The mesh over the microphones is actually fine enough so that the hot glue will not flow into the mesh. I tested that before. What I'm using here is kind of a hot glue pencil, which is quite handy for this project, but of course any hot glue gun, as you might have at home, will work just as well. So in order not to bore you, because it's really the same thing for each of those black parts, I'm just going to fast forward through them. However, what I did do is I covered one of them with tape just so you can see how that would work if you did not want to do that with hot glue. And as you'll see in a second, that's also when I remember to turn on my second camera. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting off a slice of the tape that is as exact as possible the width of the sensor on the AirPod, and when I'm satisfied with that, I'm cutting off one end of the tape. Well, I'm rounding off one end of the tape so that it matches the shape of the sensor, and I'm cutting off the second side actually on the AirPod. Now obviously that damages the surface a bit, but in the end it's just gonna be covered with paint anyways, so I didn't mind too much, and if you're careful with the cut, it's not actually that damaging to it. So it is really a matter of taste whether you prefer working with the tape or hot glue. personally, I find the hot glue a bit easier to be shaped into the round shapes, but as you'll see at the end of the video, in the case of the microphone meshes that are a bit recessed, the hot glue does leave a bit more of the white plastic exposed, but that's manageable too. Now this part I'm actually only showing you in order to tell you what not to do. I tried to cover the charging connectors with hot glue as well, but as you see in a second, as soon as I want to cut off the excess material, that is just not sticking to it. So instead, as you'll see in a second, those are better to be covered with tape. So obviously when applying the glue, you should err on the side of too much, because any parts of the sensor that is not covered could be damaged or obstructed by the paint. But of course you also don't want to have any of the white plastic covered with the glue, which later might fall off and expose the white plastic beneath. So that's why I'm cutting all that off here. And as mentioned, here is where the cover for the charging connector fell off. I'm gonna show you that now, and I'm forwarding through cutting off all those little excess materials because it's really the same for each of them again. Just as a side note, if you cut off too much of the glue at some point, or you see that some parts were not covered properly, don't hesitate to cover it again. You really don't want to have any gaps where the paint could flow into the microphone grill or could block any of the sensors that tell the AirPods it's in your ear. Now here I'm showing you how I covered the charging connectors at the bottom of the stem of the AirPod. It's really the same procedure as you just saw when I covered the sensor. It's basically just cutting a thin stripe, this time of course even thinner than the one before, so just about the width of the connector. In this case actually I would err on the side of covering too little, because it is actually quite easy to scrap off the paint of the metal part. So if this is painted over, it's not as bad, because it really can just be removed with the blade of the knife at the end. So the same goes also in the length dimension of the tape, so I'd rather cut it a bit too short than too long. But of course, the better it covers it, the more exactly covers it, the less work you'll have after you painted them. So here you see it a bit better again, how I'm actually applying the tape. So it's really just a thin stripe of tape over the connector, cutting it off, and that's really it. And then you repeat that for all of the 4 connectors, and it's really the same. So I'm speeding it up here again. Now the next thing is I'm gonna take some tape and cover the silicone tips. Obviously we would not want to have any paint on them, but given that they are attached like this, I actually don't need to use the wire as I did with my with the old AirPods, but I'm using basically the silicone tips as a handle afterwards when I paint. So here I'm just really trying to get as close to the edge of the silicone with the tape. Also note that basically the acrylic paint doesn't really stick well to the silicone, so even if there's some paint on it, it's not too bad. It basically can be rubbed off afterwards. But I'd rather prevent that from being needed and have a good seal. And then here I'm just basically spiraling the tape again to get kind of a handle, make it a bit longer so you don't get any paint on your hands when you spray. And when you've done that, that's basically how the AirPod looks when it's ready to be painted. I'm gonna fast forward through the second one again because it's basically the same. And with that, the second one is ready to be painted as well. Now, before you paint, obviously shake the spray can well to mix the paint inside. And then hold the AirPod at the created handle and spray it from all sides. I actually noticed afterwards I did not quite get enough paint on it with the 2 rounds I did, mainly because I was busy getting everything on camera, so that was a bit tricky. So really make sure that you spray it from all sides properly, especially because it's a round shape and there are some concave parts, especially on the inside where the stem hits the big bulge. It's easy to miss some of the color there. And then with the handle we made, you actually can hang it quite easily with the tape somewhere to dry. Make sure the paint dries long enough according to what your spray can instructions say. And then I would recommend at least one more full layer of paint, just so it doesn't scratch too easily, especially if you use a particularly dark color, in which case the white will show quite strongly if you make any scratches. And then let them dry, ideally overnight. Again, read what your specific paint that you're using says, but generally before you put them back into the case, I would recommend to at least let them air and dry for one night. Once that is done, you can take away all the covers with it, starting with the tape to reveal the silicone. And then the hot glue should actually be fairly easy to just chip off. And the tape you might need to peel off a bit more carefully, just because it's a bit harder to get to under the paint. Now, when I'm taking the cover off, you see at some points I actually covered a bit too much, so you see some white coming through now. I'll show you in a second what to do if that happens in your case as well. It's not a big problem, but that's where what I said before comes in, that the tape might be a bit better suited for any parts that are recessed. As you can see, sometimes I'm tracing around the shape that I'm peeling off a bit. This is not strictly necessary, but it makes it a bit safer not to take away any of the paint that you would not want to have taken away. And so I'm showing you now those white parts that you can see. Obviously they don't look too fancy, especially around the stem, which is outward facing. So what I did to resolve that is I went outside again, I took some of the paint and simply applied it with a little brush. So as you can see, I'm literally just painting by hand around the areas that I didn't do well. Now, of course, this needs to be done with care, and you can see I didn't take a very nice brush which had some hairs sticking out, and you really don't want to get any paint onto those meshes that are covering the microphone. Of course, here again you can learn from my mistakes and clean up your brush before you start with the painting. So again, this is really just me being a bit clumsy and having it done like this for the first time. If you do cover it a bit better than me, having learned from my mistakes, you can likely just skip this step. And once you've finished with that, you have your custom colored AirPods Pros. Obviously, I would recommend black or a really dark color just because the microphone cover is dark, and that's one of the things that always annoy me a bit about the original AirPod and AirPod Pro design. But yeah, you can do red, you can do pink or any other color. If you do, let me know how it turned out. I'm not sure whether you can actually share pictures in the YouTube comments, but I'd be very interested to see other people's results. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I wish you all success with coloring your own AirPods Pros.